Hello and welcome to the New York Empire podcast presented by Greatest Ultimate Bag. I'm Dan Hilton and he's Matt Pippin Auletta. And before we all move on from one of the best regular season games in recent memory, of course, it's Philly on the road already this weekend, but it's still only Tuesday. So today we're talking about the Empire's 18-17 overtime win over the DC Breeze down in Washington, D.C. on Saturday. I mean, Matt, I went through a bunch of different ways that we can start this show, and just like some kind of gigantic monument, I couldn't get around number 87, Jeff Babbitt. I think that's where we have to start because this magnanimous figure just is looming, skying us from the sky over this entire game. And I think we begin by giving Jeff Babbitt some of his flowers.
Yeah, I think the post-game interview really sums it up. He's just standing there, kind of happy, excited, but also just like steam is emanating off of him like he's some superhero. I think that pretty much sums it up.
Well, yeah, not only that, but then he gave the post-game interview for the Empire page lying on the ground, also summing up how much Jeff Babbitt gave to that game. So, to quote him after scoring the go-ahead goal in overtime, can anyone bleeping guard him? The answer to that in that game was no, not on Saturday night at least, but it is interesting because now going forward for June 30th, which we don't have to talk about too much yet, we'll preview that later, but for June 30th in that return game, obviously, I think most conversations with other teams say, okay, let's stop last year's MVP in Ryan Osgar. Let's try to limit Jack Williams. And again, we'll get into how DC actually did a pretty good job of that. But now I feel like they're going to have to start those conversations with what happens if Jeff Babbitt does what he did again to us. We have to limit that because he did end with 7 goals, 3 blocks, and an outrageous layout on a dump look from Weinberg, which just goes in the stat book as a completion. So again, you have to watch the game to understand just, again, the magnanimous nature of the juggernaut that was Jeff Babbitt in that game. And I even looked back. I went through the highlights multiple times. I watched the game twice because, I mean, if they won, I probably wouldn't have watched it twice. But going over those 7 goals and 3 blocks, when and how they happened. One of those blocks came at the end of the first quarter to keep it 3-2 DC. He caught the goal in the second quarter for the first break of the game. The goal that preserved a 2-goal lead with 6:11 left, an inside backhand break from Oscar that deserves a lot of credit too. He scored the goal from Jack with 31 seconds to go to tie it at 16. Another block, which I think he was credited with, came at the end of regulation in the crowd just to prevent any Max or funny business. Then, of course, in OT, scoring the 18-17 winner after Yacht to Fortin made it 17 all, 27 seconds left for that last one. Then with 15 seconds left, Babbitt gets his third block off the Huck intended for Rowan. And, I feel like it's definitely blended a lot more in, that being Babbitt, on offense or on defense the last few seasons with Jack and Yacht and Osgar and Lithio and Antoine and Marquez and Randolph. All those players showing up or doing their thing. But right now, Jeff Babbitt is your Empire leading MVP candidate, which automatically makes him a league MVP candidate in the too early for that conversation. But obviously the Empire's best player at the end of a season is likely going to be one of the favorites for MVP if they wind up being at the top of the league with stats and everything like that and overall record. But right now, that man is Jeff Babbitt. And the irony is, Matt, that Philadelphia, the first game of the season, he had a 0 goals, 0 assists, 0 blocks performance, the first in his career. And yet, I'm still talking about him in the MVP conversation 2 games later because of what he did against DC. That's just how important that game was. That's how important that performance was.
Yeah, I think I actually talked to Jeff after the Philly game in the rain there, and he, kind of alluded to the weather stunk. It was not as fun as he had hoped. The game was ugly, and I think that was just reflected in, everybody's play. But, I don't think Jeff really felt like he maybe needed to turn it on, not to disrespect Philly. And, this game, clearly he needed to, and he just ran through a brick wall over and over and over, and then picked up the bricks and smashed DC with them again. It was just, you couldn't stop him. And, you talked about what are teams going to do to stop Jeff? And the answer, I don't know. I wouldn't want to be tasked with trying to figure that out. I mean, did they stop Ryan Osgar even? No, not really. I mean, if you can have a sneaky MVP caliber performance where you are still +9, I mean, 3/4 of the way through that game, I remember thinking to myself, like, oh, Oscar's like kind of quiet, but he's also playing really, really great. And there's nothing anybody can do to really stop him either. He's not skying people. He wasn't throwing some of those like crazy flick bladey throws that are just dropping dimes in the end zone that everybody's used to, but he's still just out there outperforming basically everybody except Jeff. And maybe he even did in some ways, just, a little different. Because Osgar's, most of his assists were pretty short throws.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I just don't even know how teams are going to begin to think about stopping Jeffrey and some of the rest of them.
Yeah, well, I think this is where we kind of diverge with those two talking points, right? That there is credit to DC for their defensive game plan, as well as what is the difference and why did the Empire keep winning those games after game after game after game. So first to begin, like the credit to DC for their defensive game plan to make it a really methodical and slow first quarter. Again, the DC Breeze took a 3-2 lead into that first quarter. Again, they also took a lead in the fourth quarter. They found a way back. They have enough talent to do that. But I think in the first quarter, the idea that was executed properly was they forced Lithio and Babbitt into the backfield, made the Empire without Elliot Chartok work through them without giving Jack and Osgar too many touches, at least on the disc. Fortunately, Oliver Chartok got the start on O, showcased what I was seeing in the second half of last season and at Club Nationals would exist. Something happened with him last summer, and he really ascended and took that next step up, which you have to say as a 24-year-old, which is young to the Empire, but you have to take that step up to contribute. You don't get time on this team if you don't contribute or find ways to make an impact statistically and don't make a lot of mistakes, with his one throwaway coming, unfortunately, for Oliver in the fourth quarter. But we'll get back to him in a second. But going back to what the difference is. So even with the DC Breeze, I think doing a good job defensively with that game plan, and they do have enough weapons defensively to put pressure on the O-line for the Empire. The difference is the fact that Babbitt said it himself as well in that postgame. Once Ben Yacht had that huge sky over Monroe and Orton OT, he knew, that being Babbitt, he knew it had to happen. He knew the Empire were going to win that game. And it was a credit to the swing pass guys, Adam Ruffner and Daniel Cohen, on this talking point here. The Empire have more players of MVP quality that make plays. And that has been the difference. Now, DC is just as good as the Empire. They showed you that on multiple occasions over the last few seasons. They are just as good as the Empire. But the Empire have, as you mentioned, even with Ryan Osgar, a quiet day from him, 2 goals, 6 assists, 1 block, a team high +9, 4 hockey assists, no turnovers. Like, that stat line is one that players would dream of having. And that's a quiet day from Ryan Osgar. Yacht in that game had 3 throwaways, but he made a bunch of star plays that always make up from that. That throw to Antoine Davis for the third break of the game to make it 7-5, that crossfield flick. That's exactly what you're asking Ben Yacht to do on the break when you have a D-line that can do that. And then Jack had a pedestrian 2 assists and 2 throwaways, a +0 for the first time in a while for Jack Williams. I can say that. DC seemed to be very purposeful about also switching up the defenders on him to give him as many looks as possible. I saw Rowan, I saw David Bloodgood, I saw Charlie McCutcheon, I saw David Cranston. He saw a bit of everybody that DC could throw at him on those top handler hybrid type defenders, and yet he still led the Empire in total yards with 524. And he had 12 more completions than anybody else on the team, that being Solomon Royce-Meyer-Bailey in second. So Jack, for his, again, pedestrian final output of throwaways and assists, it was a bad game from his stance, but the total number of yards he ate up, the fact that he moves the disc forward as you go along, and he's a constant threat. The existence of Jack Williams and what he is capable of makes the Empire offense that much more deadly because of all those reasons. And that's why they create space for each other by being stars. And again, that's what you happen in overtime and in the fourth quarter. I mean, the DC Breeze they're not choosing to leave Jeff Babbitt open. But if you do put a second guy, and they did that for OT especially, but if you put that second guy to poach in front of Babbitt or try to close out some of his in-cuts, it doesn't matter because now Jack is wide open with 30 yards to move upfield. Now you have Osgar on an in-cut, way too open. And then that means that Lithio, whoever it may be, is in 1v1 coverage at the back of the end zone, right? And now somebody's open for a hammer or, again, that blady flick that Osgar has up over the top. Now that's wide open in the back of the end zone for Weinberg or Lithio, whoever it may be. Just being stars. It's a cop-out, but they have just too many stars, and that creates space for everyone else. It's not just they're good enough to get it done. It's that their star power does create opportunities.
And it wasn't even that they are stars. I mean, that's obviously a big part of it. But I felt like even when DC was playing pretty good defense, either switching, eating up space, just really good handler defense, just, tight on the marks, Empire players always just seemed like they were grinding a little bit harder. And, they didn't do a lot of the flashy things. Like I said, there were no beautiful blades from Ryan Osgar for the most part. There was just a lot of people making easy cuts at some point. I mean, setting them up wasn't easy, getting open wasn't necessarily easy, but the end result was often just an easy pass to reset the disc and to keep grinding. And they really just outground them. That was the major takeaway for me. And you have to be a star to get open on those defenders, especially when the stall gets high and everybody knows they're close to a block. But they kept moving. I mean, I thought Jack did a really great job just being there when they needed him. I know after a game or two in like 2019, he would come off the field and be like, I feel like I didn't do a lot today. And Brian Jones would just be like, yeah, but without you, we would have fallen apart. It's like you were the reset valve we needed so often.
Yeah, and I think, again, to the Empire's credit, that if we're 3 weeks in and I can feel, other than, Weinberg and that grab on the layout by Babbitt to keep possession, I mean, obviously the yacht sky, but through 3 weeks, I mean, there really aren't, as you mentioned, any marquee or a large number of marquee highlights. Like, I watch all the highlight packages from around the league, and, I mean, take, for example, the Royale against the Rush game. I watched that highlight package. It is just huck after huck, or it's a in cut, or it's a not in cut, but it's a layout on an in cut, or whatever it may be, and it's over and over again. You're just seeing highlight after highlight after highlight because the decisions are skeptical at best, and the Empire's highlights are so boring. They are. The 2 games that I've done so far with Trisha, I watched back those highlights and I'm like, I'm glad I got the buzzer beater Jack had at the end of the first quarter of Philly right, because is that the highlight of their season so far, right? Other than this DC game.
Yeah, the highlight. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, Ben Katz picks that off and just kind of floats it into the end zone, and Jack Sky's like 2.5 players.
Yep.
One guy was I think James Pollard was a little far away, but yeah, it's like that is one of the most exciting plays. As an Empire former player and fan, this game was exciting in a sense when it got close, and to just watch how they kind of just slugged it out back and forth. But really, the game was also a little bit of a snooze in terms of highlights.
Well, I'll ask you that. Are you when you watch this kind of game, are you like, because that's what I was telling other people that like I'm talking to, that if you watch that game, while there aren't a lot of, again, highlights, it's just the highest level of Ultimate that you could play. And as a former player, are you seeing that where you're like, oh, that game, again, isn't full of highlights, but you just feel like there's so many things going on here, as opposed to watching another game with a ton of highlights where you're like, okay, but that was really just who's got bigger throws and who's got bigger legs. You know what I mean? Who's got younger stars to do, not stars, but guys to go out there and just make the athletic play.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, what this looked like, even though it's only week 3, was 2 teams who are both poised to win the East, win a championship, and they are just approaching each game, each possession, just like that. I mean, every once in a while, a great deep shot is exciting, and both of these teams will probably come down with a ton of those throughout the season, but against each other where, it's 18-17, it's a relatively low scoring game, especially into overtime, they're just valuing possession. They're working on being as close to perfect as they can be. They don't need to make those crazy plays. I mean, a lot of them are capable of it when the disc either is, misthrown or tapped or who knows what, but they're just out there grinding for those front cone scores, or those, 15, 20-yard throws into the end zone. The heat map of where Empire scored from, even DC for the most part, a lot of possessions just ended with red zone goals. There was not, I don't even know if Empire scored a goal from beyond half. So it was a lot of grinding. It was a lot of, punch for punch and seeing who could outlast each other. And also as a fan, and again, somebody who, I wanted Empire to win, but I was really bummed out with the last possession by DC. Happy that Jeff gets an easy block and Empire wins, just run out the clock. But that throw was so boneheaded. I don't know what Malks saw or didn't see. Maybe he thought McDonald just had space to run onto that. But, maybe Rowan beats most of his teammates to that disc in practice. But when Jeff is playing like that, and then you kind of just float that out there with, I think when the camera panned to the downfield cutters, Rowan was already beat by Jeff, and all Jeff had to do was like outstride him and out jump him. I mean, Rowan's amazing, but I don't think he had a 5% chance of getting that. It was a letdown for how exciting the game kind of got and could have been. And just a little bit of a letdown from a fan perspective.
Well, somebody who, again, probably watched the DC Philly game a bit closer than I did can correct me on this, but I think something similar happened because Jeff knew there was a reason why the Empire put Jeff on Rowan for that play. Because usually it's not Jeff on Rowan in that setup in those late game situations. But the Empire knew something that the rest of us didn't. And they knew that DC was going to look for Rowan with the deep shot, which again is not usually their end of quarter activations with Rowan. Usually it's Rowan who is not the one who gets the huck, but he's the one that resets. If they have time for 2 passes, or 3 passes rather, he's the middle pass. He's the one that puts Malks in the power position for that huck. That's usually his role in those end of quarter plays. But this time around, it was Rowan who was the deep look, which again is really interesting when you think about Ben Ort and just all those other Tyler Monroe guys who you'd think of more aerial who can get there. So there's something that the Empire knew that again the rest of us didn't know. So I'm wondering what film or what game they even look back to figure that out. But again, that's why they're the coaches, and that's why that's again why that game was played at the highest level, because you could tell that both Daryl Stanley and his captains and the Empire and their captains had watched a ton of film every minute to understand whether it was truck stop, whether it was the DC Breeze, what those combinations look like, and who was going to be thrown to who, where the spots were, what the release points were going to be, and all those different things. All right, so last 2 things here real quick before we get out. Again, these are more mini pods here. Before we talk about that, we don't even talk about the how. Oliver, as I had already kind of mentioned, they forced Oliver Chartrack to kind of beat them in the first quarter, that being the DC Breeze. So he winds up 3 goals and 2 assists in the game. They said, okay, that's the guy with that Elliot Chartak here. If somebody's going to beat us, we have to make sure it's him. And at this point, Matt, I mean, I guess you already felt I was already rounding the track here on my victory lap, but I do have to push back a little bit. I am extremely vindicated because the first video of the preseason about the Dross, I said they both are going to be sensational when they're on the field, and they were both sensational in the first 2 games against Philly and Toronto, with Ryan in particular doing some awesome things, 4 blocks, can't make that up. And I promised that they were going to be and continue to be great when available. I did not say they were old. I said they may not be available for the games, but they were going to be great when they were there. And as I am kind of proved correctly, life is pushing against Ultimate more than any other year so far, and they couldn't make it. That's what happens when you're in your 30s. But the first 2 names I mentioned that could come in and contribute mightily in their absence, Oliver Chartak was one, and the other one I mentioned second was Matt Labar, who made the trip from James Madison, playing his first game of the season where he's finishing up his school year, to catch the goal for the second break of the game from Ben Yacht. And then we did see, I don't want to call him the second D-line, but the D-line that gets less reps than the Marquez Ben Katz D-line, but the second D-line in terms of reps, they had less and less of reps, if you will, going towards the 3rd and 4th quarter and overtime, of course. Those numbers went down a little bit. So you saw less and less of Matt Labar. I even predicted, though, in that video, the player that would throw the assist to Matt Labar, and I said the chemistry I saw at TEP between Yacht and Labar could pay some dividends, and it did. It was Yacht throwing to Labar. So we're 3 weeks into the season, but 3 weeks in at least, I am very, very vindicated from the video I made about telling you that if Ladros weren't available, what might the Empire do? Though you can easily push back and tell me that Oliver wasn't starting for one of the Dross. Oliver was starting for Elliot Chartak on the O-line. So, yeah, all right. I get it. But anyway, I did tell you the players to look out for. That was the whole point of that video, and I'm feeling vindicated.
Yeah. Speaking of the Dross, I mean, like you said, they weren't there, and Empire still looked pretty good on defense. Nothing came easy for DC. I struggle to think of more than 1 or 2 goals that came easy. Some of the Ort shots were pretty open before they started kind of making it a little harder. He played great, but yeah, I mean, no Dross. And it really just highlights that Empire can plug in anybody, anywhere. Oliver just pops in, same thing. I mean, if you had just told me that was Elliot Chartak and he played great, I wouldn't have even thought to look twice. It just really just goes to show what a wealth of talent they have.
Oliver is a few inches taller, so that is the way.
Yeah.
Oliver has the hat, so those things are all pretty helpful. But you mentioned Ben Ort, and the last thing we have to talk about is the fact that 18-17 overtime. Yes, the Empire won, and that is a talking point. But again, DC could have taken a shot. They could have taken that bite out of them, especially in DC. So it is almost a wake-up call for the Empire to say, we are not far ahead of DC. They are right there with us. They took us to overtime. Now, again, June 30th, and very likely with their records already this season, that I could expect that they're going to meet again sometime in the playoffs. You'd expect that. But, it's interesting because we talked about the different looks that Jack had, but the Empire largely held Boxley in check as well. 2 goals, 4 assists, 4 hockey assists, and 1 turnover, eating up 379 yards. That is actually, for him, his worst game of this season so far, because Christian Boxley has been an MVP. He's been the DC Breeze's MVP. He's arguably been the best player in the league through 3 weeks. But what the Empire did was a similar thing. Whether it was Randolph, Jeff Holm, Brenton Tan, they threw as many looks at Christian Boxley as possible. They put as many players to be, I mean, that game was very physical, so they just were as physical as you could be with Christian Boxley throughout that game. Again, he still got his, but because they made him work for it, that meant that other guys also had to kind of fill in. Ben Ort, regularly the youngest player on the field, a real difference maker for DC, making his debut with the Breeze, clearly showing you that by the end of this season, working him into that O-line, maybe adding Jock Nissen back in, that DC, just like the Dross weren't available, DC is just still putting together everything. AJ Merriman, Hamblock Yacht at 15 all, almost had the play of the game if they wind up having that. And then Cranston, Tom, Ja, McCutcheon, Rowan, Merrill, Rafuse, just so many options on their D-lines. And then even Johnny Malks, you mentioned he made that mistake on the, well, not mistake, but he had that Hail Mary on the huck at the end, and he can run that offense without Rowan. And that was a question we had for DC for the first few weeks. What would it look like without Rowan McDonald on their O-line? But 642 total yards to lead the team. Boxley's 379 were second for the Breeze, by the way. So 642, 200 plus more than everybody else on his team, being the quarterback of that DC Breeze O-line. They have talent. DC is, is this the best version of DC that you've ever seen?
I think yet to be determined. They're very good for sure. They have some new personnel and they're kind of just figuring themselves out. Rowan's on the D line, like you said. I think I'd like to see him play a little more offense. He really unlocks a lot for them, especially if they are starting to struggle a little bit. Ort was good. Boxley, as you mentioned, maybe it was statistically his worst season or worst game, but I thought he was great those first few points.
Yeah.
He was eating up a ton of space. He looked like he was just on the field all by himself a few times, and I don't know if that was by design by the Empire just to back him. But yeah, if he gets unlocked a little more, there. Also, DC has been playing Joe Merrill on defense this year so far, and in 21 with DC and last year with Salt Lake, he played the majority of his points on offense, and he is a big target, good goal scorer. So I'm also curious to see if that stays. Is he going to stay on defense as, a big body who can maybe generate some goals on a turn, or are they going to maybe shift some personnel and put him back on offense where he seems maybe a little more of a natural fit? Because, Christian Boxley, like I said, when he was getting the in cuts, there was space for him, moving the disc around. I thought he played great, but he didn't necessarily cut deep a ton. Maybe against other teams that'll be a little easier. But then, Ben Ort, he's cutting deep. He's got some space, but really they need more than just that. One of the things that makes Empire so dangerous is there's Jeff, there's Jack can just release from a handler spot or the middle of the stack and go deep at any time. Ryan Osgard can beat you with his legs or his throws. Lithio is big, but he also comes under sometimes. They're a little more fluid and a little more dynamic, but at any point in time, 5 of those guys could go deep and probably be favored in their matchup, where with DC, that's probably not the case. A good deep cut from any handler, sure, all of those players are capable, but like true deep threats where it goes up and you think like, oh, they probably have it. I would maybe think that a little more if Rowan was the one releasing deep or Merrill was releasing deep. So, curious to just see how they kind of figure out where they want to put all their pieces. I think they have the pieces to be, team 1, 2, 3, 4 in the league. Absolutely. Just be really interesting to see how it all comes together for them this season.
Yeah, and it's such a chess match between those coaches that know each other so well, because how much of your hand do you show before the playoffs? Like, again, kind of knowing, obviously if you're Philly, if you're Boston, well, Philly's in trouble now, but if you're Boston, if you're Toronto, even still, if you're Montreal, you're thinking, okay, we, don't count us out yet. But again, if you're DC and New York, you're saying, okay, we're likely going to meet again in the postseason. And what do we have? What final things can we showcase in that moment when we have to? And I think, not to say that it's pretty obvious, but we know that, as you just mentioned, the break glass in case of emergency plans are already pretty well known. If DC needs to fix O-line or needs to do something there, Rowan's going to move over. If the Empire give up 3 breaks or 4 breaks in a quarter, Ben Yacht's getting some O-line points. Like we know, and we saw it in that game. Ben Yacht moved over to the O-line. So did Rowan. Those are the first break glass case of emergency. But as you mentioned, there's a second layer to that too. How many O points is John Randolph going to play? How many times is John Randolph going to play 2 or 3 points in a row? Remember, he's in his early 20s still. He can do that. And then how many, on to that point, Joe Merrill is almost a similar age. So is it 25, 26? Joe Merrill can also play O-line points, right? And it's a matter of when does the Empire and DC Breeze say, okay, let's ride with 13 or 12, right? And because that's what's going to happen in the playoffs, where it's going to be, we've got 3 or 4 points here that are going to decide this game, and we've got 12 or 13 stars that we both trust to get this job done, right? And it's how short do you make those lines? And I think, again, a credit to the Empire's championship run last season, that because of the margins of victory in the playoffs against Carolina and against Chicago, it was all good vibes because they were able to play everybody the entire games because they was overbid in the first quarter for Chicago in the championship game. And you're like, okay, D-line or D2 line, like, whoever it may be, you're getting major minutes still for Ryan Holmes. Like, you're able to promise that you're going to get the captain time. Ryan Holmes being one of the captains, but you're going to get them time because, you can go that deep. Again, DC, it just feels like everything shortens, everything tightens, and what team is going to have that final piece of the puzzle to say, okay, we still have that move to make that you cannot anticipate for, that you cannot, you think you prepare for everything. But last question here, we can talk about the playoffs and all that later. Last question for you, Matt. Philly this week, they've already beaten them once. Now they're in Philadelphia to do it. What is the week after this kind of game, this kind of, again, emotional release? You could see that Babbitt, I can't remember a time when he was this animated in that way in a game. Like, this, again, was a marquee Jeff Babbitt performance. But what does it take to make sure that you're ready to go against a team you've already beaten, against a team that is struggling, that is 0-3, that is desperate at home and all those different things, and make sure that you don't have that let off this week?
Yeah, I think that they are internally motivated just to win and be as good as they can be. They have too many good players that even if 5 of them were somehow checked out for the game, would it even matter? Maybe the score would be a little tighter, but I'm sure the rest of them would reel them all in. I mean, there are players that we barely mentioned that are probably all-stars on other teams. I mean, Antoine Davis is just, do we even mention him? You mentioned him like for 1 second. He's just an amazing player that's like almost an afterthought in some of these games. But if you like really were to watch his points throughout all these games, like he also played really good defense. Mm-hmm. Matt Stevens, he played a few points with that, D2, D1.5, whatever you want to call it. And I think he threw 1 throw in the game, except it was like a 35-yard hammer that completely unlocked the break side. And then Ben Yacht threw, I believe, like a nice assist from there.
That was Matt LeBar. Yeah, that was the Matt LeBar second break of the game.
Yeah, that was the one. Yeah, there you go.
Yep, broken up by Matt Kett. Yep.
It's just, are other teams like least played players unlocking the field with a perfect throw over the top to just roll down the break side? Like, probably not. So, other players, if D2 gets more reps, I know that those guys want to just, get some stats, get out there, show what they can do, and just play a little more and have fun. And, it's always a good time to kind of mix those D lines too. Maybe not D1, D2, maybe just like 1.5, and just everybody play, get a little chemistry together just in case you need some changes here or there. It was around this time last year where Empire moved Ben Yacht to defense. So, I don't expect a massive change this year, but it's still nice to see who can play with who, where the chemistry maybe develops as the season goes. So they're going to be hungry. They're going to be just fine.
Yeah, I mean, I will say the Empire are the only team in history of the AUDL who have the option to put the number 4 goal getter of all time on one of their D lines. And again, that's what happens over time. But Cat has taken that role on, and again, that popping that hammer out to Ben Yacht. If you watch the Empire game in and game out, that's actually not a surprise. That's the throw he throws more than the other. It's that hammer over the top to Ben Yacht is the one that he only throws it to Ben Yacht. No, not to let other teams let but Yacht finds that space in the break side for him. But okay, yeah, so that's it. 18-17 overtime win for the Empire. We, depending on the results, I don't want to promise these shows every week, but especially for this one, we had to do this one. So we'll see, especially this week, Philadelphia, then it's a week off. So again, don't expect anything that week. and then it's the road trip for Boston and Montreal. So that's what's on tap in the future. But again, Matt, thanks for joining me. We'll hear plenty from you this season up in the booth with me on the sideline as well. And then, yeah, for the rest of you, we'll see you soon.